Welcome to Google San Francisco, and thanks for joining us for our latest installment of Design Is, called Design Is Screenless. So today we are very excited to welcome Golden Krishna to be our speaker. Golden is the author of the book, The Best Interface is No Interface. Before coming to Google as a design strategist, Golden served as a designer at Cooper in San Francisco, and then also on innovation teams at Samsung and at Zappos. So his book, The Best Interface is No Interface, was actually an essay to begin with. And the essay reached such great acclaim that he ended up making it into an international lecture tour, which was very successful. And tonight, we actually have a few books to give away, so we hope that you will stick around for the Q&A as well. And with that, I'd like to welcome Golden Krishna.
Thanks, everyone, for being here tonight. It's incredibly exciting to talk to all of you. The first time I ever got on stage and uttered this phrase was way back in 2013. I really had no idea what I was talking about. The idea has come a long way since then, and this lecture is completely different. I got up on stage at South by Southwest, and they gave me a 60-minute time slot. I could only think of 40 minutes of stuff to say. I forgot 15 minutes of it on stage. And after I gave the talk, and it seemed to have a good impact, I started thinking about what other talks I can give, sort of companion or sister talks about it. And I started working on this other talk called Addiction UX. And it felt like, and I wasn't the only one who was just feeling this way, but it kind of felt like, a lot of people were stopping discussions around what design is really about, like elegance and efficiency. And we're starting conversations around the metrics we should focus around, things like how many clicks are we generating, how much time spent are we getting. I prepped this talk for a major interaction design conference. My boss at the time was super excited about this talk, so he bought the domain name addictionux.com. And I submitted to the conference, and they rejected it because they thought this isn't really a relevant topic. Maybe I didn't do a good job of conveying it, so I kind of forgot about it. I made it a chapter in the book, and it's an interesting chapter in there. But what's interesting is that from that moment in time, about 2013, to where we are in 2018, this has become less theory inside and more pop culture and norm and fact, theory to fact. There's a Wall Street Journal essay, Saturday essay about addiction. There's a Washington Post style section piece about addiction UX. More and more people are talking about it. And unfortunately, it seems like that's kind of become a factual statement about our industry, that our output is more screen time for more and more people in the aggregate. Children in the United States who are under the age of 8 tend to look at a screen for about 2 hours a day. Teenagers, when they're not eating Tide Pods, tend to look at screens for about 7.5 hours a day. Adults look at a screen over 8 hours a day. And even employees at Apple are walking into glass walls because they're looking at their screens. There's consequences, of course, to all of this screen-based thinking. That when people are driving, they're distracted by the screens in their car. About 1,000 people every day are injured, CDC estimates, by someone being distracted by screens while driving. In fact, the National Highway Safety Administration, after seeing decades of less and less fatalities on highways, is starting to see a spike up, and they believe that's because people are distracted by screens while they're driving. The number of pedestrians being hit by drivers is going up after years of falling. The color temperature of our screens, which mimics midday, which does that to produce these deep blacks and bright whites, has been shown in study after study to throw off our sleep cycles because it suppresses melatonin, which throws our body's rhythm off. There's a great podcast series and a fantastic book called Bored and Brilliant, which talks about how our moments of boredom are actually our most creative moments. But now that we're constantly distracted by all these people trying to solve moments of micro boredom, we're actually less bored and as a result, less creative. We're less empathetic when we look at screens instead of people, especially in an adolescent period. If you pull some fifth graders away from screens, even for a number of days, studies have shown that they become more empathetic, they understand each other a little bit better, and in a world that's sort of divisive and fighting with one another and looking for separatists and nationalists, it's kind of odd and interesting that screens may play some part in that. And without a doubt, a lot of people understand that they are addicted. There's a poll of teenagers done recently in the United States where over 50% of them admitted that they felt like they were addicted to their smartphones, but almost none of them knew what to do about it. So a lot of sort of tech makers have gone around and gone on this sort of like apology tour, as I would call it. They're kind of saying they're sorry for creating the like button or whatnot. And they're in these different articles in The Guardian, and they're saying they're waking up in the middle of the night in cold sweats after making hundreds of millions of dollars. But I think one of the things that a lot of these people are missing is they're thinking about ways we can sort of suppress technology. They're thinking about ways we can get people away from screens. And I think there's something sort of fundamentally wrong about that. I mean, to make a sort of unexpected but sort of I think related analogy, if you're thinking about something like air pollution, and you're worried about coal power plants polluting a lot of emission, you could say people should just use a little less power, and maybe that's true. Maybe there's some energy efficient things we can do, but really the real solution is to jump into solar power, which is clean energy and can employ more people. Maybe instead of driving, you're thinking gasoline cars are another issue. And so maybe you say, maybe people should drive a little bit less, and there's less air pollution that way. And that may be true, but the real and the long-term solution to that is to shift and to push technology and to embrace electric cars and find a way for there to be a better solution. And I think it's a little unfortunate that a lot of people have been saying those things. And tonight, I really want to talk about how we can take technology to another level where we end up disrupting each other less. And instead of talking about how we can hide our phones, we as makers can find ways that we can disrupt people less. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Somewhere at some point in time, we fell in love. I really don't know when. Like all relationships, it seemed to happen in the blink of an eye. From the blur of whatever we were doing before to a passionate, unquestioning love for the modern, handsome, beautiful interface of the moment. Apps. What's great about the iPhone is that if you want to check snow conditions on the mountain, there's an app for that. The commercial continued, our pulses quickened. And if you want to check exactly where you parked the car, don't tease me. We all know how to end that phrase. 6 beautiful trademark words that may have unintentionally fenced in this generation's limitations on technological creativity. There's an app for that. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is 99 cents to download. An app, just by being an app, doesn't guarantee that it produces anything of merit to anyone, anywhere, but please, shh. We must defend our loved one's honor. An app's creation is told as a gospel of wonder and miracle. We're blessed that someone wrote working code that somehow illuminated the dark mythical path to Apple or Google's app catalog. The New York Times featured an App of the Week and had a reoccurring App Smart Extra column with heart-throbbing titles like A Weather App That Works. And during the financial crisis, the New York Times featured a Bloomberg app as App of the Week because it revealed, quote, basic stock market data. Maybe you're thinking, I'll just turn on Talking Heads CNN and forget about my app, Muse. Think again, my friend. Here are some real CNN headlines. No TP? There's an app for that. Remote sex? There's an app for that. Need to pray? There's an app for that. Can't sleep? There's an app for that. Heart attack? There's an app for that. Giving birth? There's an app for that. Dead? There's an app for that. I want to get into this by oddly looking at a picture of a toaster. Now, this is a picture of a toaster from the late 1940s. It was a time in which we were inspired by fast-moving things, by aerodynamic forms, by cruise ships and airplanes. So we took the toaster and we made it aerodynamic. We love things like fast-moving streamlined trains, so we made fast-moving streamlined irons. We thought things like cruise ships were amazing, so we made apartment complexes that look like them. Today, we're obsessed with something a little bit different about smartwatches and smartphones, even failed technology like 3D television. So today, our everyday products look a little bit different. This is the #1 selling toothpaste in the United States. It's called Crest 3D Whitening. Because unlike all the other toothpaste in the market, this one is 3D. This is one of the top-selling sunglasses on Amazon.com today. Promises you HD vision. Doritos doesn't make potato chips today. They 3D print them. Chevy makes HD pickup trucks. A mattress company doesn't advertise a mattress with a picture of a mattress, but with a woman sleeping on top of a fully charged battery icon to remind us why we sleep. As these are everyday objects, are cultural reflections of how much technology has taken over our mindset. But if you want a little more empirical data of where we might be headed, one of the interesting things to look at is what young people are studying. And more young people are studying things related to technology. Even at well-rounded universities like Stanford, that used to be known for their psychology program, it's becoming more and more of a computer science school. At art schools around the world, there's less and less interest in the traditional graphic design and industrial design, and more interest in things like interaction design. There's all this excitement, all this momentum, all this talent that's here in this room and that's coming. But so often we set a sort of low bar. We do something unfortunate because no matter what the problem we hear, we often have the same answer. Question: how do you make a better car? Above is one of the earliest patent drawings for an automobile. The technologists of the day solved a real problem with transportation. And as a result, the car changed the way we live, the way our cities are built, who and what we can see and when and where we can see them. So today, utilizing the amazing technological progress we've made in the over 100 years since, what technique have modern technologists used to improve the car? Answer: slap an interface on it. Who would need to look at the road while driving? Leaning over to touch a screen is so much more fun. Tesla is one of the most innovative companies in the world. That's why they've got a 17-inch touchscreen center console. Sure, there are some haters. Some lost soul, The Verge wrote, "I don't want a web browser in my car, and more importantly, I don't want the drivers around me to have one." But consider scroll bars in your center console. I know, amazing. Question: how do you make a better trash can? Answer: slap an interface on it. Hope you got this obvious one. You can make a better trash can by turning it into a $47,000 LCD recycling bin so that you can see if it's raining outside when you're standing outside in the rain. 100 of these incredible bins were installed in London just before the 2012 Olympic Games to help the city show off its futuristic wonders. And why not? Screens are so futuristic. This is a set of job listings from some of the top technology companies. You'll see something a little unusual about these job listings. They advertise for these UX/UI designers. But of course, user experience and user interface are two totally different kinds of roles. And a UI designer's job is really important. It's to compose all of the elements on a screen so that it's readable, that you understand it when you see it. But a UX designer's job is to talk to the customers, understand their problems, and try to solve those larger problems. When you conflate the two, when you conflate solving problems with making screens, well, then you make it someone's job to solve problems with screens. The good UX, good experience design isn't a set of good screens, it's a good experience. Look, don't get me wrong, I'm saying some negative things about screens today, but these slides wouldn't exist if it wasn't for some kind of interface. This event probably wouldn't have come together if we weren't some had those wonderful liquid displays that we have. But I think there's a lot we can do together to greatly reduce the amount of screen time that's necessary in our lives. It wasn't that long ago that our lives are filled with paper. And there were some people who dreamed of a paperless world. Now, instead, our lives are filled with screens, and I think it's time to dream of a screenless world. I think that the best graphical user interface is no graphical user interface. And so I wrote this book about it. It's called The Best Interface is No Interface, and it talks about how and why we can build this screenless world. The book has 3 principles inside of it. The first principle is to embrace typical processes instead of screens. So when you're making something, understand how someone typically does something and use that as your constraint rather than a square rectangle. This is some video footage of Dr. Michael Rothberg. A number of years ago, something undocumented in the psychological field happened to him. He wondered if this psychological event that was undocumented happened to anyone else. So with another doctor in the hospital in which he worked, he designed a survey for the medical staff. They found that an astounding 68% of the medical staff had had that same undocumented psychological experience happen to them. They published the results of their findings in a medical journal. The study was repeated the next year with some undergraduate college students. This time they found that 90% of those college students had that same psychological condition. Dr. Rothberg and his colleague called this ringxiety, or phantom vibration syndrome, which is the paranoia that your phone is buzzing and beeping when it's not. Kleiner Perkins estimated at one point that the average American in the United States who owns a smartphone gets about 150 notifications per day. A study done in the UK found that people who live in London get over 200 notifications per day. It's all these services looking for addiction, looking for clicks and taps and time spent that are screaming, "Let me out, take me out of your pocket," buzzing and beeping. But there's a different way of thinking about how to create great technology. A number of years ago, the Moves app launched, and this was their original app icon. They got acquired by Facebook. Their icon looks different now. It's the letter M. But when they first launched, they had this beautiful skeuomorphic thing. Conceptually, I thought there was something really fascinating about what they were showing. Now, the Moves app is just a digital pedometer. It's not as fascinating as the concept of what they were showing here, because what they were saying was our app works best while it just sits in your pocket. This is where our app thrives. Unlike all those other services that are buzzing and beeping, we want you to keep your phone in your pocket. Now, in order to get any value out of the Moves app, you had to sort of look at this data dashboard, so take your phone out and look at it. This is not so great. But there's something really interesting, I thought, conceptually about this idea of having a back pocket app. Here's a different problem. People lose their keys all the time. A startup called Lockatron tried to solve this problem by making an app for that. But they also had a companion sort of door, a deadbolt cover. So it covers your deadbolt. And then their app has this pretty simple UI for unlocking your door. It's a giant button that says unlock and a giant button that says lock. Pretty straightforward from a UI standpoint. And you might look at that, and you might look at that even from a wireframe and think, okay, yeah, that's pretty good. That's all we really need. But that's kind of looking at it from a UI standpoint. If you kind of take a step back and look at it from a UX standpoint, it's how someone actually goes through using Logatron. It looks a little like this. So first, you walk up to your door, and you want to open it. So step 2, you want to open your door, so you take your phone out of your pocket. Step 3, you want to open your front door, so you wake up your phone. Step 4, you want to open your door, and with iOS at the time, you swipe to unlock. Step 5, you want to open your door, so you enter your PIN code or use your thumbprint. Step 6, you want to open your home door, so you hit the home button next to your last opened app. Step 7, you want to open your home door, so you hit the home button next to your last opened group. Step 8, you want to open your home door, so you swipe through your sea of icons to try to find the Logatron app, if you can remember what it's called. Step 9, you tap the Logatron app. Step 10, you want to open your door, so you wait for the Logatron app to load. Step 11, you want to open your front door, so you tap the giant unlock button. And step 12, you want to open your door, so you open your door. So Locatron took a look at this, and they actually had heard a little bit about this first principle, embracing typical processes instead of screens. And they wondered, is that actually possible? Could we eliminate steps 2 through 11, which are all about screens, and just kind of embrace someone's typical process? And when they gave themselves this different design constraint, they realized, yeah, actually we can. It's not that technologically advanced. We can turn on some Bluetooth in our deadbolt cover, have it so that when you get to a certain proximity, the deadbolt just unlocks, so you can just walk up to your door and just open it. And then they made this second generation video, and they came across something, right? I mean, they went from screen-based thinking, which we've been doing for the last 30 years, to screenless thinking, which is where I think we're headed. And after they made that video, they generated over $2 million on Kickstarter. That's really good for a door lock. There's other back pocket apps that are out there. This is another unlocking one where you go up to your computer, Mac ID, and it just unlocks your computer. There's a bike lock that copies the same model where you can see here the phone's in the pocket, the back pocket app, it just unlocks the U-lock. There's a team at Google who had worked on some hands-free payments, so if your pocket's in your purse, it talks to the register. There's another back pocket app that Square had worked on for a while called AutoTab, where you walk into a cafe, your name and your most recent orders pop up on the register. It's a back pocket app for payment. There's a startup called Ginger.io, which is in San Francisco, and they had worked on a back pocket app for people who suffered from severe depression, and they looked at all sorts of signals, like when are you leaving the house, are you calling friends and family. There's a back pocket app for health professionals. Apple released a small little back pocket feature when they talked about, do not disturb while driving. Uber is certainly not a back pocket app, but their moment where you just walk out of the taxi or the car without taking your phone out of your pocket is actually, they have found to be their most delightful moment. So they spend all this time on the UI, and it turns out the moment that people really love is the time when they don't even look at the UI. So, I think when we start thinking about these typical processes, instead of thinking about a rectangle and how we can fill it, we start to open up a whole new world of opportunity. The second principle in the book is to leverage computers instead of serving them. So all of the incredible technology that's come in computing in the last few decades, taking advantage of that instead of using the same old ways to sort of think like a computer and think like a database. You go to the Smithsonian Museums in Washington, D.C., you'll see some of our greatest collections. Inside, you'll find IBM's Deep Blue supercomputer. It's famous, of course, because in 1997, it beat Garry Kasparov at a game of chess. We had known for a long time that computers and machines could outmuscle us in construction equipment and whatnot, but we didn't know at that moment in time yet that computers would sort of outthink us, out-strategically think us in a game. So we took this supercomputer with all of its incredible processing power, and we put it in a museum for people to admire. But if you compare Deep Blue's incredible processing power to sort of the dusty old Dells that we just kind of want to smash up sometimes, maybe even just throw out the window, these terrible, awful, annoying machines actually have an incredible amount more computing power than Deep Blue ever had. So this supercomputer that we admire in museums couldn't stand a chance to these terrible computers that we still have laying around collecting dust. But we still make these bizarre experiences. Built with incredible computational muscle, born with the ability to access its own exact location anywhere in the world, created with the innate thinking process to provide more timely and richer knowledge than an entire public library in a millisecond, formed to remember a generation of enlightenment, computing devices have sadly turned into this, like us at our worst. A state of life, the terrible twos, when we are an emotional wreck, struggling with rules and responding to unexpectedness with simple variations of a single word expressed through our limited vocabulary. No, no, no. No, your username is not valid. No, Chase Bank Online requires numbers in your name. No, your name isn't unique enough for Gmail. Pick another name. No, you can't leave that blank. You need to give us your title, Dr., Mr., or Mrs. It is mandatory at the London Heathrow Airport to connect to Wi-Fi. No, your password is not strong enough. No, it's not long enough. No, it needs an uppercase letter. No, it needs a punctuation mark. No, not that one. No, you cannot use one of your last 20 previous passwords on JetBlue. No, dates have to be MMDDYYYY at the New York Times Online Archive, not MMDDYY. No, I don't care if it'll be another 100 years until that matters again. No, these fields are required. Do it now or I will turn red with rage. See, we live in this world where, despite their incredible power, we serve computers. We're forced to think like computers in order to interact with them. But I think we can reverse that situation. I think we can make a world where computers can serve us more often. This is the announcement of the iPhone in 2007. And I think it's very easy to look back at this moment and think this is the moment in which our screen time sort of exploded. But there's a small moment in the presentation when Steve Jobs talks about 3 things that are going to be in the iPhone that are going to make the UX better. It doesn't even show a UI when he talks about it. He talks about 3 sensors that are built into the phone: an accelerometer, proximity sensor, and a light sensor. And he talks about those things, those kinds of sort of machine input, can change the way computing works. It was the first time I had ever heard someone kind of talk about how we can use things like radios and sensors, things that computers and machines have built into them, rather than user input. Now, unfortunately, when Steve Jobs showed how this could be so powerful, he showed rotation as the primary purpose of the accelerometer. So here he is showing cover flow. Not the greatest use of the accelerometer, but interesting. Here's a problem, timesheets. A Harvard Business Review study found that some companies, some extremes, people are so bad at keeping track of their own time that you can lose up to $50,000 a year per employee. So a startup called Timely has been trying to solve this problem. And in 2014, they launched this kind of nice looking UI. It's a calendar. You hit the plus sign when you've worked on something. You type it into the form field. You have another form field for how long you've worked on it. It's got some kind of nice smarts. And I think if in a typical kind of company, if someone made a presentation like this, we might think, oh, that's a pretty nice UI. That's a pretty nice experience. Has some little nice defaults in there. But Timely kind of took a step back at what was going on, and it works a little bit like this. You do things on a computer, and then you tell the computer you just did those things on the computer, and then you do things on the computer, and then you tell the computer you did those things on the computer, and then you do things on the computer, and then you tell the computer you did those things, and it's just kind of weird back and forth. And a lot of people don't want to even go back to the timesheets, and they forget to do it. They try to do it at the end of the week. They can't remember what they did on the computer, and it's weird because it's all happening right here, but the two things don't really talk to each other. And when you're doing it, obviously you're working with all this user input, right? Checkboxes and form fields and drop downs and radio buttons, all this kind of really annoying kind of things that we have to deal with. We have to serve computers. But they started wondering, can we use another kind of input, these kinds of machine input techniques where we can listen to signals and radios and device activities, plug into APIs, so the machine can input rather than the user. And when they thought about their problem in this way, they ended up converting their software. And about 4 weeks ago, they launched something called Memory AI, which is timesheet software that automatically populates based on the things that you're doing on your computer. It looks at what files you're opening inside what folders, who you're meeting with, and based on that, they can automatically put together timesheets. Pretty nice. It's passive background computing. It's the no UI kind of experience. They went from user input, which we've been doing for a long time, how we serve computers, to machine input, how computers can serve us by listening to a number of signals. Now, what's really interesting is when I was digging into the time tracking software space, this notion of no UI has actually taken over a lot of the industry. TimeCamp, Chrometa, Rescue Time all have passive tracking ability. In fact, if you were to launch time tracking software today, to launch a UI is considered bizarre. It's one of the first verticals that I've seen shift from primary selling point to be a nice UI to primary selling point be a no UI experience. It's really interesting. Now, there are other sort of companies and other really interesting examples of using simple kinds of machine input that can leapfrog other competitors. This is a photo I took while I was in Sydney, Australia. I got out of my airplane. I was there to actually talk about some of this screenless stuff. And I saw this ad. It said, "What if your phone could make your car cooler?" And it was a picture for their app, right? You open up their app, you tap this climate tab, you tap this turn climate control on, and it takes 15 minutes for your car to cool off. So on a hot day, you have to kind of try to remember 15 minutes before you get to your car, launch the app, do all the things, and then do this thing. Okay, very okay. So Toyota looked at the same problem, and they thought, okay, well, this is pretty simple, right? You have your car, it's sitting out there, and it's a hot day. It's probably sitting in a hot parking lot. It's something we've had for a few hundred years, a thermometer. We can put that sensor inside the car, and when the thermometer reads that it's hot inside the car, we can turn on little fans and open the sunroof and just cool off the car automatically. We don't need to rely on user input and hope that someone downloads an application. We can use machine input to let this stuff happen automatically. Now, one of the nice things about what Toyota did here is they assumed that on a hot day, the sun is beating down on your car. So they power the entire system through solar energy. So there's actually a small solar panel there. It doesn't use any extra electricity. It actually generates what it needs. Pretty interesting, different kind of input mechanism. As Shona mentioned, I used to work at Zappos labs, where we used to experiment with different kinds of technologies and ways that Zappos can enter new lines of business. Sometimes I did sort of like one-off and interesting experiments. This when we became the title sponsor for Beta Breakers, which is the second largest race in the world. There were some interesting opportunities for us to do some experimental work. One of the things I learned is that the race expo, which happens the day before your race, you get your race number, then you get pummeled into these giant stores, one of which we would have, these pop-up stores, 70,000 people. These things can get totally out of control. I had heard from some lightweight user research, some previous people who were going to the expo, that they had to wait for 40 minutes in line to just get an extra water bottle, or so maybe they had a pair of socks that they forgot for the race. And it was a not so great experience. So I wondered, can we do things? Can we kind of set some metrics and try to create a new kind of experience? Or maybe we can cut wait times in half, or make it so that somehow people can funnel through within 60 seconds. Are there opportunities to do that? At the same moment I was trying to do that, there were some people at Zappos who were running a small race series across the United States, and they had these RFID reader mats, and they're working with this RFID company where you can run it when you run across the finish line. It just tracks your time because you're wearing an RFID chip. The mat reads that you've crossed, and then it knows how long it took you to run the race. And when I saw this technology and I saw this team working on it, I wondered, could we bring RFID mats and RFID tags into our pop-up shop at the Race Expo? So we built this sort of little prototype inside our studio. We built these little Google SketchUp things of how this thing could work, how you could walk over the mat in this area and we could scan it. And then we had the arduous task of opening every single item and putting individual RFID tags on them. Only took 12 hours, but not a big deal. Thank you for all the volunteers who did it. But we created this really cool experience. And when we built the space, we ended up with this really nice sort of like magic checkout experience. And people ended up sort of flying through it. Now, there is a screen there for them to confirm that we accurately scanned their items. But other than that, they just kind of fly through the experience. And it was a really nice sort of way of us shifting from the things that dominate the retail experience, the kind of self-checkout, scan each item, do user input to go through form fields, to figuring out ways of machine input and sensors can kind of alleviate that from other people. We ended up cutting wait times in half. We actually had really short wait time, about 2 minutes. Average person in total waited for about 48 seconds. So that was a really huge success for us to kind of shift things. Some of those ideas we fuel to Lab 126, and some of those ideas help fuel Amazon Go, which, as many of you know, is a cashierless, as we imagined, experience where you can just grab items and leave the store. Now, thinking about these kinds of sensors is not something we typically talk about in design schools or in conversations. We talk about things like typography and color and composition. We don't often talk about how you can bring sensors into your work. So I made this PDF with one of my friends, Megan Lynch, where we went through how people were actually using smartphone sensors in different use cases. And you can download it here through that link, nointerface.com/toolkit. Some students at Babson College in Boston emailed me recently because they downloaded the toolkit and then they used those ideas to win a hackathon, and That's pretty nice. So hopefully something like that can happen to you if you start thinking about how we can shift away from user input. The last principle of the book is to create a system that adapts for individuals. This is maybe the most difficult part of the experience. I actually got my design technology career started by working for a guy named Alan Cooper, who started a place called Cooper. And in the early 90s, he was thinking about how to bring great user experience into software, while other firms like Frog and IDEO were more focused on industrial design. And Alan is sort of an outspoken character that I would say literally fights for the users at times. There's this great story of Alan being brought into the tech museum in San Jose during a donors dinner. So they had people from Microsoft and Adobe kind of sitting down. And this is the early 90s. So Alan kind of boots up his PowerPoint presentation and it crashes. He asked if anybody in the audience was from Microsoft. Some people raised their hand. He stood on top of the table, screamed at them, told them they're the reason that technology sucks. So Alan literally fights for users, a super interesting person to work for. One of his big contributions to the interaction design field is that he took the idea of personas from other kinds of industry and showed how we can use them in designing technology. Now, a lot of personas are really difficult. A lot of people don't have the time or ability or kind of struggle with getting personas right. But if you can get the right qualitative and quantitative information and create these sort of aggregate small set of sample users, it's helpful to try to figure out how you can solve their problems and goals that way. Now, it's not the only technique. There's plenty of other techniques. But what these techniques generally point at is designing for averages. You're really lucky if you can figure out what your typical target customer is like and the things that they want to do. It takes a ton of user research and work to get to that point. And this is sort of the pinnacle of UI. It's a design for like the perfect averages. But when we forget UI and we go to a screenless world, all of a sudden we don't need to make this one size fits all. We can make lots of different kinds of experiences. And instead of designing for averages, all of a sudden we can design for individuals. We can design for you. Now, this really changes the way you can kind of make experiences. Okay, here's a problem. Saving money. A lot of people in the Western world, pretty terrible at saving money. So a startup called Digit, it sets up by linking into your bank account, seeing how you're spending your money, and finds ways to shift money from your checking account to your savings account to slowly kind of build, let you spend like you normally spend, but slowly kind of build a savings account. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward idea. But Digit didn't launch with an app. They didn't need UI. They weren't looking for clicks. What they were trying to do was solve the problem in the most elegant, background, passive, automatic way possible. And if you needed to communicate with Digit, you communicate through text message back and forth. And those are individualized experiences when you do. Okay, here's another problem, income volatility. So if you look at freelance workers or hourly workers, they're not always sure what their next paycheck is going to be. Sometimes your shift has many hours. Sometimes your shift has few hours. Sometimes you're a freelance worker, you get a ton of projects. Sometimes you get few projects. So because you have that income volatility, you have the inability to predict how much money you're going to have, and you're not quite sure if you can make big purchases like buy a car. So a startup called Even tried to solve a financial problem by looking at individuals. And so what they did is they look at the kind of paychecks that are coming into your checking account. And when they do, they start to figure out ways they can kind of average it out. So using their ML models, if you get paid a little bit more, or you get paid a little bit less, they're looking for a way to sort of mitigate that risk. And what they do is every 2 weeks, they give you an even paycheck. So you know exactly how much you're going to make every 2 weeks. And if that's going to change, they'll let you know ahead of time. But it's nice because it kind of solves that at a very individual need instead of trying to launch an app to get people to swipe and tap and click on more things. Okay. There's so much we can talk about when we talk about the best interfaces, no interface. Just go through some of the reactions and concerns. I first wrote this in 2012. It was actually based on the Futurist Manifesto, if anyone knows what that is. And I thought it was a total rambling rant that no one would care about, but it turns out some people did care. It got some positive press in different places. I've done a ton of podcasts about these ideas in different ways. Here's two of my favorites. One's in Boag World, one's in Intercom. They're both totally different, interesting listens if you like podcasts. I gave this talk in Germany, and after I gave the talk, one of the members went out and installed an RFID chip inside his hand because he believed in this idea of machine input and how he could bring it to his life. A little crazy. Don't expect anyone here to do that. Actually, I'd recommend you probably don't do that. But interesting, he sent me these photos. There's a guy who used to work at Berg, which is a old Internet of Things group in London, who wrote this piece called No to No UI, which is about how everything I'm talking about today is utter bullshit. So if you're interested, that's a nice piece to read. There's another guy named Scott Birkin who wrote in reaction to all this sort of no UI talk that why are we even talking about any of this stuff? This is all garbage anyways. Interesting reaction. Okay, so sometimes people ask like some interesting questions, like what happens when these seamless, screenless, automatic, invisible things fail? What are you going to do? It's kind of like asking what happens when the power goes out or what happens when the air conditioning stops working. What happens when these background things we don't really see stop working? And I think any great automatic system always has some kind of failure mechanism, right? So the simplest possible automatic experience I think we all experience every day is automatic sliding doors. And you can typically push to open automatic sliding doors if the power goes out. Now, one thing I'm seeing a lot of people do is they're shifting the UI from the primary experience to becoming the secondary experience as a backup. This is a headlamp that Petzl makes that has what they call reactive lighting. It's really popular for people who do cave search and rescue. So they're looking into deep, dark caves, and their light brightens, their headlight brightens, and then they look at their maps, and instead of being whitewashed, the light dims. So they can read their maps and still do cave search and rescue. Now, this is just a headlamp that has a little sensor that uses machine input to try to figure that stuff out. But it comes with a piece of software. So if you don't like the automatic settings, you can go in the software and kind of tweak the automatic settings. Nest is another piece of hardware that hopes that it fades into the background, that it hopes that it just gets the cooling and heating correctly. But if it doesn't, it has this giant UI as a backup where you can kind of tweak it. Another question people ask is like, what about privacy? What about all this data you have to collect in some of these cases to make these no UI experiences work? And without a doubt, this is a study done when Obama was in the White House. They tried to do a privacy study to see if people were concerned about data collection, and well, not surprisingly, they were. And there's a lot of things you can do to mitigate that. I mean, some of it is just really sort of simple stuff, using clear language and settings menus and whatnot, and kind of letting people know what's actually happening. Some people do some more interesting things. In Evernote, if you link two services together, it doesn't link forever. You actually say for how long you want those services to be linked. So it's kind of nice when you're signing up for all these startups that want to help you and personalize your service. There's a notion inside the data science industry, not one that I came up with, called minimum viable data, which talks about how you just should collect the smallest amount of data you need to get the job done. So if I'm trying to sell you great running shoes, I don't need to necessarily know what kind of house you have. I just need to know the right data for the job. And minimum viable data can be really powerful because it forces you to think about the things that really matter. There's a big question of like, how do we go from here, where we are in a screen-based world, to there in this sort of screenless world? And one thing I sort of brought up very briefly, but I think is really an interesting case, is to look at the electric car, which was launched in the early 90s. And when it was launched, there was a lot of big questions. When you try to go from gas to electric, you're raising a whole host of issues for customers to try to figure out. For example, infrastructure. If you run out of electricity and you're driving an electric car, where do you go? There's a lot of gas stations, but there's not a lot of electric stations. That's a big problem. Maintenance. If you're driving an electric car and it breaks down, the parts inside that EV1 were so different than in a gas car. It's really difficult to understand how to do maintenance. So what ended up happening in the automotive marketplace was that hybrid cars became really successful, right? Because hybrid cars, if you ran out of electricity, you can still go to a gas station. The infrastructure problem is solved. And the inside part, the maintenance part of the car is a little bit different, but it shares a lot of similarities with how a gas engine works. So we went from gas to hybrid cars to electric cars. And I think when we look at the UI to no UI space, which seems utterly daunting, how do we go from understanding that we do these sort of static mock-ups and these screens to jumping to this no UI world? There's a lot of sort of in-between hybrid things that people are starting to think about. People are talking about voice and suggestive interfaces. Even when they start talking about small things like little suggestions, they start talking about not really understanding what's going to go in this space. And you have to get used to this notion that you don't really control the full experience and that you're kind of guiding people through it. And it opens up the conversation to feel less and less ownership over every single tiny pixel detail and understand the sort of larger picture of what's going on. So it warms us up for sort of this no UI space. Okay, so much to talk about. I'm just going to read from the last chapter of the book, and then we'll conclude this talk. One day, I hope you think this book is utterly boring, passé, and that you hear about this idea of screenless solutions and yawn. The best interface is no interface? Wake me up when you have something interesting to say. Because if that day comes, remember to celebrate. You'll be living in a better time, not one drowning in screens with intentionally addictive interfaces that distract us from one another, but one in which typical processes are embraced. When computers serve us instead of us serving them, when technological systems are continuously adapting to our individual needs. A day, probably a few decades from now, when children dress up as their grandparents on Halloween by sticking smartphones to their faces. Look, I'm like Grandpa who stares at his giant phone all day. That day will be joyous. I hope that today's marvel becomes tomorrow's mundane, that no UI is like watching a rerun of Friends. But that day may not come. This book is a journey to just one possible future. Some of the companies I've mentioned for taking us toward that future may have already disappeared by the time you've read this book. If there's enough dust on the cover of your copy, some of the examples in this text may feel ancient. I hope the ideas in this book aren't forgotten, though, but end up as stepping stones to something far greater, a future in which the best case of a graphical user interface has been understood as no interface. Along the way, there'll be battles to be fought inside companies and classrooms, privacy issues to tackle, and other unforeseen hurdles. But when the philosophies settle, the debaters come to agreement, the doers understand how to get it done, and the business plans start to fall into place, we could have something utterly revolutionary in our hands. And when that revolution finally comes to fruition, we may think of it as the most boring, expected solution. No screens? Tell me something I don't know. Here's to hoping for that boredom. Thanks.
Hi. So I read your book 3 years ago when the book first came out, and
Awesome.
it gave me
Thanks.
a lot of inspiration and really make me think about designing in the future is really understanding how, technology can be assisted, can be in the background. And I think that there's a lot of components that actually needs to fit into that vision is machine learning. And I think that fundamental will change how we design. However, machine learning has a lot of technicalities that I think as a designer needs to tackle. And I'm interested in your point of view on how, kind of like moving into the background, what kind of new skill set, technicality that a designer will be defining for the future.
One of the things I just kind of threw up there was like suggestions happen, and you can create, if you're trying to create this no UI world and you're trying to teach your ML models how things work, you have to keep in mind when you're making these things how to best teach your ML models, because if you can teach them well, then you can fade away the UI faster and faster. You can get faster and faster to this no UI experience, right? For example, a lot of music services have these like really straightforward and kind of simple like thumbs up, thumbs down. That's what we typically kind of think of, like, is this helpful or is this not helpful? That only tells you some part of a story, right? I think as UX designers, understanding how someone actually goes through experience and knowing what those things might indicate and how you can teach your models that way are really, really useful. If you can do things where you can kind of test little suggestions or little tidbits that work along the way to help you understand how people are actually going through something and use that to teach your models, I think you can do some really fascinating things. Rather than doing thumbs up, thumbs down, for example, trying to find ways where you can get people more quickly to their goals. So you intercept them and you kind of help them teach your model. You give them incentives. So I'll give you an example. So for example, let's say I threw on your home screen weather in Cupertino. Maybe you live in Cupertino, but let's say you don't live in Cupertino. You can say at the bottom, is this suggestion helpful? And you can click no. And that's it. And we don't really know much more than that. Or we can give some kind of correction method. And then I can say, actually, I live in San Francisco. And we can correct it on the fly and teach our ML model in maybe a more interesting way. Nonetheless, what I'm getting at is there are tons of opportunities as designers to try to figure out how to best teach our models if we're aiming to try to do that kind of thing. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think there's a lot of interesting things that we need to consider about that relationship rather than sort of just draw a box and say, oh, it'll all be sort of solved in here. I think we need to think about how we teach and inform our larger systems.
You gave a chatbot as one of your examples, and this might even be related to machine learning as well. Do you actually think chatbots are a good solution to anything these days? And if so, do you have any rules or principles to help you decide if it's the right tool for the project?
So there are times, I think, when something like a chatbot can provide really simple kinds of information. I actually think there's a direct correlation between what chatbots are good at and what voice UIs or voice interfaces are really good at, which is not everything, but really tiny, simple stuff. So I think, there's a lot of websites. I'm thinking about United has this thing where they have a fake person at the top, and you can click it, and then you can kind of ask them any question about United, and 99% of the time, it's not at all what you wanted. Just like that kind of open platform, voice also has that similar problem where you think you can ask it anything, and you can get the exact thing that you're looking for, just like as if you were talking to another person. But if you can somehow constrain it down, I think one of the nice things Amazon did when they launched Echo was they kind of said, these are I don't actually know the number off the top of my head, but let's just go with this number. These are the 8 things that it can do really well. And so you can set a timer, you can have it play music, but you have to sort of constrain that world. And I think the same thing is probably true if you're creating a sort of a chatbot kind of answering system, is that it doesn't do everything. Because at this point in time, that's pretty hard to get right. It would take way too much time. So if you can kind of constrain the problem and let people know somehow that this is going to only solve this small number of things, there can be some nice stuff there. I think when people use things like an Echo or a Google Home and they learn the couple of things, they tend to stick to those couple of things because they know they work. And I think that can teach us a lot about how we can sort of bring these technologies in a constrained fashion and not over promise what they can do, because each one of these kinds of things can cut off little bits of what normally UI can do, but you have to know which bits it's going to do well and not just think it's going to be everything.
I think it's kind of ironic that this screen or this microphone has its own screen.
That's amazing.
They should have looked at your talk first. So I'm wondering, because since we're at Google right now, and some of the biggest companies here kind of rely on screens and interfaces to make money via ads. Mm-hmm. Who will pay for these UIs that don't have a UI, or who will pay for these services that have no way to push things to your eyeballs?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that has happened is that the rules of the game were that if you could do something to generate more eyeballs, you knew that there was a way to make revenue from that, right? You kind of enter this game, you're like, I want to make a technology company. Oh, if I get eyeballs, that's great. And with eyeballs, I can sell advertising. And that's just sort of like an established revenue set. And people kind of understood that and did whatever they could to kind of generate that. And there are some things that are kind of nice about that. If you're a content creator and you have some videos online or something about explaining how things work and you have little ads, that's nice. But I think there's sort of like a new set of rules about ways people can try to make money in this kind of world. When I think about like meal delivery services like Blue Apron, they run on subscription, right? And so what they're hoping for is provide sort of meals that you like at your front door on a subscription kind of service. Now, subscription is a totally different kind of revenue model than trying to get more eyeballs for advertising, right? And that's one possibility. But there are other possibilities of just like, you buy a nice piece of hardware and it costs this much, and that's a transaction. There are a ton of open questions of like, how do we create a marketplace where it's not about getting people addicted, but how do we show people how you can make money in a space where it's not that, right? Chrome extensions, I think, are a really interesting example of that, where Chrome extensions try to assist in experiences. So typically, a Chrome extension will kind of see what's going on your web browser and try to mitigate and help you accomplish your current goal. For example, there's a Chrome extension called Honey, which tries to generate coupon codes while you are on websites. So it's trying to help you out. It's not like Honey is trying to get you addicted to their platform, maybe a little bit, but they're not trying to drive eyeball time. They're trying to help you solve a problem in the need. Now, that's in a UI, that's on a screen, that's not off a screen. But I think when looking at some of those companies and how they create valuable technology, I think it starts to open up doors. But I don't know what all those revenue models are. I think that is an interesting and necessary kind of exploration that's kind of starting to happen with some of these startups. Like Timely, for example, does sell a subscription service and different kinds of plans based on the number of people who are using it. But their hope isn't that you click on, they actually hope that you almost never click on it except to generate reports. When I talked about Digit, which is like a savings plan that happens in the background, they don't want you to interact with their application. It just happens to work in the background. I don't actually know how Digit makes money, but I bet they take a little bit off the top when they're transferring money to your savings account. I don't know though. I'm not sure. They charge a fee. Okay, so there you go. So they charge a fee for their service. Okay, yeah. So I don't know if these things will work or not. If that sort of old school transaction of like, I want something, it costs money, will still work in our digital economy. But maybe there are ways to make it work. And I think it's about replicating some of those successful models and discovering new ones that work.
Awesome. A really great talk tonight. I'm kind of curious, when you were writing this book now in hindsight, is there anything that you might have wanted to include that you didn't include for whatever reason?
Yeah, I mean, so the last principle is to adapt to individuals. And it was sort of it's a part that I've really wanted to sort of expand more and more and more. The first principle to like embrace typical processes, I think resonates with a lot of people. They understand how to do it. But I think that last principle is feels a little more theoretical than I would want it to feel. It's just because it's really difficult to imagine these kind of individualized experiences, but it's a really powerful notion. The typical process thing, you get it. You're like, oh, 3D space. I have some examples in the book that talk about how when, BMW had made this app about unlocking your cars, but Mercedes-Benz had worked on technology where you lift your door handle, you understand the typical process of trying to get in a door. All that stuff really resonates. But then when I talk about making these adaptive experiences for each person, it's kind of like a mind, kind of messes with your mind a little bit. And to the earlier question about like training ML models or how this stuff kind of works in an AI first kind of world, how do these things kind of come together? Those are really big and interesting and juicy topics in designing for AI at large. But I don't think it needs to necessarily even be as complicated as a lot of people make it. A lot of people assume they need like these huge data sets to try to pull something very simple off. But maybe I didn't include enough examples. If you just learn these 3 things, you can pull off a ton of things. Or if you use this one API, you can pull off a ton of things. There's a number of startups that work around just like scanning your email. They don't have to necessarily start by like trying to collect all this information. They just look at your email. There's one that I'm forgetting the name of right now, that just kind of looks at like what you paid for certain items and sees if it can kind of give you if the price of the item has changed in the next couple of weeks. Oftentimes credit card companies will make up that difference for you, or even the stores will. So they just kind of look through your email, they're like, oh, this price dropped. Here's $10. There's some interesting things that can go on when you just collect like one thing. There's interesting things that go on when you create individualistic experiences. Yeah, but I think that third principle is something that I wish I could have spent more time on. Maybe being the third principle and making that be the later part of the book I was working on made me rush that part just out of pure logistics. But yeah, I think that is really fascinating, and I don't quite know if people totally get how fascinating that is.
So you're a design strategist now at Google?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I am. Yes, I am. Yes.
Can you talk about what you're working on now, even broadly? If not, that's okay.
Okay.
But do you feel like, given the sort of like very broad thinking that you've done here,
Yes. Yeah.
what do you think is the most sort of tactical way? Just, I'm sort of interested in your take on what is the best way to bring this to life.
Yeah. Sure.
And sort of is the best way for you to be a design strategist and to advise sort of a technology company?
Yeah.
Or is it to keep doing talks? Because it's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Sorry for my initial reaction. I think I wasn't quite sure what you were going to ask about Google, so I didn't know where we were going. Okay, awesome. So I work very vaguely. I work on a team that does like 2 to 3 years out, like experimental stuff about where we can go with Chrome and Android. Generally, what I do. How do you bring this to your teams? How do you form new teams? This is another thing that is a really interesting topic. I once talked to a designer. One who has significantly more experience than I do, and he was trying to become a designer in the software industry in the 1980s. And at that time, a lot of stuff was going from command line to graphical user interface, another shift in the paradigm. And he had a really hard time selling companies that he would come in and do things like choose the colors or draw icons. That felt like a really weird thing that they didn't understand what his value to the organization would be. And so he kind of struggled, but teams obviously have changed dramatically since that moment in time, and that kind of role is assumed, whereas there's new kinds of roles that are not as assumed, right? Like a lot of what I'm talking about, if you're thinking about how to bring in sensors and radios and technology like that, you might have a person who's a mechanical engineer who understands that stuff better than the other people who might be in the room at the moment you're trying to brainstorm a solution. You might have a data scientist in the room who's not typically in the room. Oftentimes, data scientists are relegated to do things like business analytics, and they look at they create these nice sort of charts and graphs that tend not to be part of the creation process. So kind of making a bridge to bring them over to the other side. Even quantitative general information tend not to be part of the creation process. So there's new teams that can be done, but what about in like the short term? What thing can you kind of just take away from this talk? Well, when I showed that slide about Locatron and how they thought, okay, well, they drew out their thing and they thought, what if we just had no screens? Is that actually possible? And all they did was just turn on a Bluetooth radio, which is not that technically complicated. But they would have never thought of that had they not tried to take a step back and get rid of the screens and the experience. So even if it was like a 30-minute brainstorm of these are the endpoints these are a typical process that our customers are going down, how can we just embrace those things and try to eliminate as much screen time as possible along the way? Maybe they're coming from this thing to that thing, or that they've previously done this, and we can see, we can get rid of this and this and this and this, and that can be really powerful to just try. Because I think most people don't even try. They just think, this is really complicated. I'll go do that some other point in my career.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks
Thanks
so much.
everyone.